So yesterday we saw the Mishnah, which had provided us with a lot of foundational principles that we had already learned before. One of them is that no matter how many brothers die in rapid sequence, even if there are many brothers left over, one brother is allowed to do yibum to all of the women. You don't have to share the wealth, so to speak. So the Gemara is just questioning the language, because the Mishnah had said that if you have 4 brothers and they all die, then the surviving brother can do yibum. So the question is, there is no surviving brother if there's 4 brothers and all of them die. So the Gemara says, Arba achin sal kedaitach, you think that there's only 4 brothers? So Ela Ema Arba me achim. So rather there's like 20 brothers, right? And 4 out of them die. So then the oldest surviving brother has the option of doing yibum with all of the Yevamos. He doesn't have to share with the other brothers. So Harashus biyado, he has permission. So the Gemara says, V'shav kilei, do we really allow him? Like, wouldn't we advise him against it? As we'll see in just a moment. V'hatanya, look at the Brisa. The Brisa says, V'karu lo ziknei iro, that the Torah, in discussing the mitzvah of chalitza, says that the elders will call out to him to summon him to court. And what we learn from that language of they will call out to him is that, number one, hein velo shluchan, that the rabbis themselves must make direct communication with the yavam and not through a proxy. And v'diberu elav, and when the Torah says they shall speak to him, this teaches me melamed shemasin lo eitza hogenes lo. This teaches me that the dayanim are not these stoic, very passive and objective people. The rabbis have to be able to relate to the yavam and offer him advice that is beneficial to him. She'im haya hu yeled v'haya zakena hu zaken v'hiyalda, that let's say they realize that the yavam and the yavam are not compatible. They look at the yavam, he's 18 years old, and the yavama is 50 years old, or vice versa. So you know what they're going to say? Omrim lo malach eitzel yalda, malach eitzel zakena, klach eitzel shekemoscha, ve'al tachnis kitata b'veisecha. They'll say to him, listen, what do you need with such a young girl? Or what do you need with such an old woman? Why would you bring strife into your home? Marry someone that you're more compatible with so that it will be much better off for you. So the Gemara says, isn't that also the case over here? Why would we ever advise someone to do yibum to 4 different women from 4 different households? He's going to end up with, maybe he has his own wife already, 4 additional wives. Is that really advisable? I mean, 1 is hard enough, right? Certainly from the financial standpoint, and then all of the other issues. So the Gemara now says, Lo tzricha de efsherlei. We're dealing with a brother who's a tycoon. He can afford it. And because he can afford it, that's why the Mishnah gives him permission to do yibum with 4 different women. Ihachi afilu tuvanami. So if that's the case, then why only 4? If he can afford it, if he's the Bill Gates of Yevamim, so then why not tell him to do yibum with 8 women, with 20 women, right? So Eitza Tova Kamash Malon Dalid in Tfelo Ki Hechidim Tayi Ona B'Chodesh. The answer is that the number 4 is deliberate, because this way he'll be able to consort with each wife at least once a month. Now, what do we mean by this? Because a Talmud Chacham, the Gemara says, is supposed to have consort with his wife once a week from Erev Shabbos to Erev Shabbos, Friday night. So if you have 4 wives, you're at least giving each wife their rights of being your consort once a month. So that's what the Mishnah is telling us, is that more than 4, it's not appropriate, because then each wife is going to feel deprived. But at least if she gets once a month, so then that's great. Okay. Misha hayanasoi v'chulei. Now, if a man was married to 2 women, and then he dies, so the Mishnah had told us something that we know clearly from before, is that there's only a mitzvah of yibur machalitza to one of them, and once you do that to one of the wives, the other wife goes away scot-free. So uniyabim litaravaya. So the Gemara is really just questioning how we know this. Maybe the halacha should be, based on the psukim, that you should do yibum to both women. So Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Amar Kra asher lo yivna es beis achiv, bayis echad hu bona ve'ein bona shnei batim. Based on the language of the pasuk, the Torah says, this shall be done to a man, referring to chalitza, who does not build the house in the singular of his brother. So we learn from the verbiage that it's only one house that you have a mitzvah to build. You don't have a mitzvah to build the second house. So once you do yibum to one, you're done. V'nachlotz l'teravayo. Okay, that's fine. Maybe that's only true with yibum, but maybe when you do chalitza, maybe it's proper to do chalitza to both women. So Amar Marzutra Bar Tuvia Amar Kra. Beis chalutz anal, bais echad hu choletz vein choletz shnei batim. We have the same verbiage when someone does chalitza. It says the house of the removed shoe. So you see, then the singular it says house. So you see from here that you only do chalitza to one woman. You don't do chalitza to two women. So we're going to insert the text of the Bach over here. The Bach then says that the Gemara's next question is v'nachalotz l'chada u'niyabim l'chada. But maybe, okay, fine. Maybe you can only do yibum to one woman, and you can only do chalitza to one woman. But maybe if there are two wives, you should do yibum to one and do chalitza to the other. So the Gemara says the answer to that is Amar Kra Asher Lo Yivne Kevin Shelo Bana Shuv Lo Yivne. That no, you can't do once you do chalitza to one woman, you can't do yibum afterwards, because the Torah says this shall be done to a man who shall not build his brother's house. And what we see from that verbiage is once you are under the rubric of not building, then it's a mitzvah lo saseh. You can't build anymore. So we know for sure that once you do chalitza, you can't do yibum to the other woman. But then the Gemara says, well, then reverse the order. Uniyabim l'chada v'nachlutz l'chada. Back in the text of the Gemara. Then do yibum first to one wife, and then do chalitza to the other wife. Maybe that's the requirement. So Amar Kra im lo yachpots hachafetz yiyabim kol ha'ola liyibam ola lechalitza kol she'en ola liyibam ein ola lechalitza. This is again something that we've seen before. The only time we learn from the pasuk that if a man doesn't want to do yibum, he has an option of doing chalitza, which teaches me that the only time you can do chalitza to a woman is if you had the option to do yibum. But if you don't have the option to do yibum, because you already did yibum with the other wife, and we know that you can only do yibum to one and not to two, then automatically I know that you can't do chalitza either. And that's how I know that if you did yibum to the first wife, you cannot do yibum or chalitza to the second wife. Va'od, and furthermore, I'll give you another argument. Shelo yomru bayis mikzaso banoi umikzaso chalutz. That it's not proper for people to say that this man died and part of his household was built up, and the other part of his household was distanced or removed. That's not what we want to see. That if you do active chalitza after you did active yibum, it's going to look inappropriate that like one woman was actively rejected. I think that's the way I'm understanding the Gemara. So the Gemara says v'yomer. So what's the big deal if they say that? At least they'll know that yibum was done with at least there should be a remnant in the brother's name. So idimiyabim v'harder chalitz hachanami. So the Gemara says you're right. If a person would do yibum first and then chalitza, there really wouldn't be anything wrong as far as the image of it, because at least people will see, look, the guy's virtuous. He wants to fulfill the mitzvah of building up his brother's home, and then once he's done that, he'll do chalitza to the other one by creating a severance. That's not so bad. But ella dilma chalitz v'hadar miyabim v'kamle below yivna. However, the concern is that if he first does chalitza and then he wants to do yibum, then it's a problem of, and again, there's a whole problem with the girsa here, but then there's a problem of once he's already done chalitza and he's created a severance, he's not allowed to build anymore. So ultimately, the Gemara's argument is that either from an appearance standpoint, if he does chalitza, it doesn't look, it's not going to look right for him to want to do yibum afterwards because he's rejected one woman, or the argument really is that you can't do yibum and then chalitza because of the problem that only a woman is only subject to chalitza if she's subject to yibum, and you can't do chalitza first and then yibum because kevin shalobana shuv lo yivna. Once you've done chalitza and you've refused to build, you don't have the option of building any further. Ve'ema ki'ika chada tiskayim mitzvahs yibum ki'ika tarti lo tiskayim mitzvahs yibum. So the Gemara says, maybe I'll learn the psukim this way. You're telling me that I can only build one house, right? So maybe there's only a mitzvah of yibum when there is only one house, when there's only one woman. But maybe if there are multiple wives, two or more, then I don't even have a mitzvah of yibum because the Torah is only speaking in the singular. So maybe the mitzvah is only when there's only one woman available. And when there's two wives, then there's bichlal no mitzvah of yibum or chalitza. So the Gemara says, Im kain saras erva da'asar rachman olamali. Hashta beis ba'alma omart lav b'nei chalitza v'yibum neinun saras erva mibaya, question mark. So the Gemara says, but that's not logical, because if there was no mitzvah of Yibum or Chalitza when there are two wives, then why do we need a special pasuk to Asr Tsaras Erva? What is Tsaras Erva? It's when you have two wives and one of them is an Erva, the other one is a regular woman, both of them don't fall to Yibum. Well, if there's already not a mitzvah of Yibum, when two regular women survive their husband, then surely you don't need a pasuk to tell you that a Tsaras Erva is not shaykh to Yibum, because no two women are shaykh for Yibum. So that's the Gemara's argument. The very fact that you have a pasuk to Asr Tsaras Erva is a proof that two women do fall to Yibum. So the Gemara says, no, that's not a proof, because alam alo. It's the Rechsalka Daita Chamina, Erva Avroi Kayama B'Tisyabim Tsarasa Kamash Malan De Asira. The Gemara says, no, I could argue differently. I could argue that really when there are two available women that fall for Yibum, there's neither a mitzvah of Yibum or Chalitza to either of them. Why do you need a special pasuk to tell me that a Tsaras Erva is Aser? Because when one of the women is an Erva, it's as if she's non-existent vis-a-vis the Yavam. And maybe you might have thought without a pasuk that it's just like there's only one woman who falls for Yibum, and therefore there's a mitzvah of Yibum or Chalitza to that woman. Kamash Malan the pasuk that no, since she's the Tsar of an Erva, even in that case there's no Yibum or Chalitza. So that's not a good argument. So the Gemara says, we're back to our original question. How do you know that there's a mitzvah of Yibum even when there's two wives, even when there's more than one wife? The Gemara answer is, Ela Yevimto Yevimto Riba. The answer is because you have the word Yevimto in the pasuk written twice unnecessarily. The pasuk says, Vimlo yachpot sa'ish lokachas es yevimto, that if the man does not wish to marry his yevama, also yevimto hashara el hazakim, then his yevama will go to the gate. You don't have to write the word yevama a second time. The reason it's written a second time is to teach you precisely this halacha, that when there's more than one wife that falls for yibum, there's a mitzvah on both of them. Next, haisa echas keshera. If one of them, the last thing we learned in the Mishnah is that if one wife is puzzle for the kahuna and one wife is kosher for the kahuna, then if you're going to do chalitza with the puzzle woman. Because why should you gratuitously and unnecessarily puzzle the good woman or the kosher woman from the kahuna by giving her chalitza if you can give chalitza to a woman who's already puzzled to the kahuna? And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yosef, Kan Shana Rebbe, Lo Yishbach Adam Meibaru V'Achem Tzrichim Lahem. Here is where Rebbe applied the metaphor of a person should not waste his well water just because he doesn't need it and spill it out gratuitously just because he doesn't need it. Someone else may need it. And therefore, just like over here, some other Kohen may want to marry this widow. Why should you unnecessarily passel her from the kahuna by giving her chalitza when you can give chalitza to the tzara who already is passel for the kahuna? A kohen can marry a widow.
What about a grusha? Is that not a grusha?
Right, a grusha. Right. So we're talking about where two women fall to yibum. One is a grusha and one is just a regular widow. Okay, let's go on to the next Mishnah. Hamachzir grushaso v'hanose chalutzaso v'hanose krovas chalutzaso yotzi v'havlad mamzer diver Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva teaches us about the following three women. A man who remarries his divorcee after she had been married to another man. That's an Isser Lav. We know that. Another case is if a man marries his chalutza. That's also only an Isser Lav. Now, remember, we discussed this. When you do chalitza to a woman, she does not revert back to an erva of Eishes Ach. She reverts to a mitzvah lo saseh of Asher lo yivna es beis achiv, that since you did not build her, you're not allowed to ever marry her again. But it's a mitzvah lo saseh, it's not an erva. And the third case is if a man marries the sister or any other relative of the woman he did chalitza with. In all three cases, according to Rabbi Akiva, even though there's only a mitzvah lo saseh, Rabbi Akiva has a unique shita that the vlad is a mamzer, that if you have relations with that woman and produce a child, that child is a mamzer. And as you know, we do not paskin this way. We only paskin that a child is a mamzer if the isser is kares or worse, right? But that's Rabbi Akiva's shita. You have to divorce her, plus the child is a mamzer. V'chachamim omrim ein havlad mamzer, and the chachamim say the child is not a mamzer because it's only an isser lav. Umodim benose krovas gerushaso shavlad mamzer. But what they do agree with Rabbi Akiva is that if you marry the sister of your divorcee, that mamish is an erva. If you marry your ex-wife's sister, your ex's sister, that's mamish an erva, because as long as your ex is still alive, her sister is an erva to you, And therefore, if you have a child with her, so then the child is a mamzer. So the Gemara now says, "V'sover Rabbi Akiva hanose krovas chalutzaso havlad mamzer?" Question mark. How can you suggest that one of the three cases that Rabbi Akiva said the child is a mamzer is if you marry the sister of your chalutza? V'ha'amar Reish Lakish kanshana Rebbe achos grusha midivrei Torah achos chalutza midivrei sofrim. It seems like Rebbe taught us, and this seems to be something that's uncontested by any Tana, that the sister of your chalutza is not even an Isser Deoraisa. There's no Isser Deoraisa of your chalutza's sister. She's only an Isser Derabbanan. And if she's only an Isser Derabbanan, then how can Rabbi Akiva say that the Vlad is a mamzer? So the Gemara says, you're right, Tani Krovas Gerushasa. So you have to say that there's a misreading in the Mishnah, and instead of it reading Krovas Chalutza, so it really supposed to be read as Krovas Gerushasa. The sister of your ex, not the sister of your Chalutza. There Rabbi Akiva says that even though you're divorced from your wife, but since this woman is an erva, the child is a mamzer, and that's where the Chachamim agreed to Rabbi Akiva. Only on that case, the Hachinami Mistavra, the Katani Seifa, Umodim Benose Krovas Gerushaso Shavlad Mamzer, and it's only logical to assume that you have to reread the Mishnah, because what does the second part of the Mishnah say? That the Chachamim agreed to Rabbi Akiva in that specific case. So Iyamart Bishlama Iriba Hainodikatani Modim, Eli Iyamart Lo Iriba Mayu Modim. So if you tell me that Rabbi Akiva had that as one of the three cases, then I can understand why the Chachamim say, we agree to you, Rabbi Akiva, in that case. But if Rabbi Akiva was not even addressing that case, then how can you say that the Chachamim agree to him in that case? He wasn't talking about that case. How can you say, well, we agree to you when you marry your ex's sister? Rabbi Akiva wasn't addressing that case, so how can you say the word umodim, we admit to you in that case? That wouldn't make sense. So the Gemara says, "V'dilma hakamashmalan deyesh mamzer michayve krisus." No, maybe the way you could read it is like this. Really, Rabbi Akiva was not talking about achos gerushasa. Why then did the Chachamim say, we agree to you, Rabbi Akiva, in this case? We agree to you that when there's an Isser Kares, then the child is a mamzer. That's all they mean to say. So the Gemara says, "Haketani lo lekamani zehu mamzer kol she'er basar shuhu below yavo divrei Rabbi Akiva Reb Shimon HaTeimani Omer kol shechayav and olav karis bidei shamayim." So, but that's something that we're going to learn explicitly in a later Mishnah. We're going to see that later on DAF Mem Tes, that it's going to say explicitly that there's a machlokus between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shimon HaTeimani, that when the child is a product of a mitzvah lo saseh, Rabbi Akiva says the child is a mamzer, and Rabbi Shimon says that no, the child is only a mamzer if it comes from an Isser Kares. So v'halacha kidvarven, and we know that we paskin like Rabbi Shimon. So why is it necessary for the Chachamim to reiterate that in this Mishnah? If that's what the Chachamim mean to say, that we don't agree with you, Rabbi Akiva, in all those three cases that you mentioned, but we do agree that a chayve krisus is going to create a mamzer, then why did they have to say it if it's already explicit in the next Mishnah? V'dilma kasasim lantana kareb Shimon HaTeimani. The Gemara says maybe that's gufa what they're coming to teach, is that the Chachamim agree to Rabbi Shimon of the next Mishnah that the halacha is you only create a mamzer through a chayve krisus. So in Kain listening shar chayve krisus krovas grusha solamali elishmamina iriba. So the Gemara says, well, if that's all the Mishnah was trying to do, was just to say that, well, we paskin like Reb Shimon HaTeimani that you create a mamzer through chayve krisus, then why did you only choose this one specific example of chayve krisus, of achos grushaso, of your ex's sister? You should have listed a whole bunch of cases of chayve krisus, or just say generically chayve krisus you produce as a mamzer. So the Gemara says that's not a good argument, because v'dil mola olam lo ay riba v'aydi the tana machzer gerushaso v'nosei chalutzaso krovas chalutzaso tani nami krovas gerushaso. So, but you could always argue like this. Maybe all the rabbis are doing is saying, we agree to you, Rabbi Akiva, only in a case of chayve krisus that the child is a mamzer. Why did they choose the specific example of achos gerushaso of your ex's sister? Because since Rabbi Akiva was talking about cases of chalutza, cases of grusha, so they chose an example that would fit in with the genre, with the theme that he was using. But not that Rabbi Akiva was specifically talking about achos gerushaso. Maybe Rabbi Akiva wasn't talking about achos gerushaso at all. And the Chachamim were just coming to say that we disagree with all three cases, but we agree that when there's chayve krisus, you will produce a mamzer. So Ela Krovas Chalutzos Rabbi Akiva Havi Mamzer. So therefore, it sounds like we must conclude that according to Rabbi Akiva, we're not going to reread the Mishnah. According to Rabbi Akiva, Taka, it turns out that Krovas Chalutza, so your Chalutza's sister, if you have a child with her, he holds that it's an Isser Deoraisa and the child is a Mamzer. So Amar Reb Chia bar Abba, Amar Reb Yechanan, Hainu Taima de Rabbi Akiva, Dar Makra, Beis Chalutza Na'al, Hakosov Karo Beso. And therefore we have to come up with a source text for Rabbi Akiva. If Rabbi had said that the child is not, that the Isser is only an Isser Derabanan, where does Rabbi Akiva get this din that there's a mitzvah lo saseh to marry Achos Chalutzaso, the sister of your Chalutza? So Rabbi Yochanan comes along and he says, you know what? There is a pasuk that Rabbi Akiva has. The pasuk is, the Torah calls a Chalutza your house. It says, Beis Chalutza Noal. If the Torah calls a Chalutza your house, it means that she's considered related to you by the Torah, just like you're an ex-wife. And if that's the reason, if for that reason, just like an ex-wife's sister is usher to you, so too a Chalutza's sister is also going to be usher to you midioraisa. Ergo, just like Rabbi Akiva would hold that any Isser Lav produces a Mamzer, so too over here, a Chalutza is an Isser Lav Deoraisa, and therefore it will also produce a Mamzer. But of course, as we mentioned, we don't pasuk in that way. Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Reb Shimon bar Rebbe, Hakol Modim b'Machzer Gerushaso, Shahavlad Pagum Lekahuna. So, even though the Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Akiva, and they say that if you are Machzer Gerushaso and you have a child with her, the child is not a Mamzer, but they will agree that the child is pagum, which means that the child, if let's say they have a daughter, the daughter cannot marry a Kohen. She is tainted in some way. She's not a mamzer, she can marry a Yisrael, but she can't marry a Kohen. So man hakol modim Shimon HaTeimani, the afal gavdar Shimon HaTeimani, ein mamzer michayve lavin, he de mamzer lohavi pagum miyahavi. And it's referring to Shimon HaTeimani who argues with Rabbi Akiva. Even though I hold that you can't create a mamzer unless it's chayve krisus, and therefore machzer grushaso is not going to produce a mamzer, but still the child is pagum to the kahuna. Now, how do we know this? Mikal v'chomer me'almanu l'kohen gadol. Ma'almanu l'kohen gadol she'en isur shava bakol bana pagum, zu she'isur shava bakol eno din shebina pagum. It's a kal v'chomer. The Gemara says, listen to the kal v'chomer. When almana marries a kohen gadol, we learn from later Gemaras, from the Psukim, that the child is puzzled to the kuna. If an almana marries a kohen gadol and they have a daughter, that daughter cannot marry a kohen. Now, if that's the case, and yet the Isser of an almana is only to one man in the whole world, who's the Kohen Gadol, then surely when the Isser of a Machzer Grushaso applies equally to all men, to all Jewish men, then surely the product of that union should produce a pagum child, a child who cannot marry into the Kohuna. So the Gemara says, but that's not really a good kal v'chomer, because ikal mifrach mala almana shekain hi atzma mischaleles. Now here it's a good, like it would be good to diagram the Gemara. We've just presented you with a kal v'chomer to prove that the product of a machzir grushaso is a pagum, is puzzle to the kahuna. And we did it through a kal v'chomer from a man almana to a kohen gadol. Now we're going to present 3 challenges to that argument. Our first challenge is, maybe the kal v'chomer is faulty. Why would the kal v'chomer be faulty? Because there's one thing that's unique by an almana when she marries a kohen gadol. Not only is it a forbidden relationship, but she has tainted herself permanently through the marriage itself. Because when an almana gets married to a kohen gadol, before she had gotten married, she could marry a regular kohen. But now that she's entered into this forbidden relationship, she has permanently tainted herself from ever marrying a kohen. Let's say she marries a kohen gadol and the kohen gadol dies. She cannot now marry a regular kohen because she's tainted herself. And maybe that's the reason, because of her own personal taint, she produces a child who's also puzzled to the kahuna. But when a man is machzir grushaso, in what way has she tainted herself? What are you going to tell me? By marrying a machzir, by her marrying her former husband, she's puzzled to the kahuna? She already was puzzled to the kahuna previously.
She's a grusha. Because
she's a grusha. So therefore, there's nothing that she's doing when she marries her first husband that further taints her in any way. Okay, so maybe that's, and therefore you can't prove from almana to a kohen gadol that the child is pagum, so too the child will become by machzir grushaso. That's question number 1. Question number 2. Va'od hi to'eva ksiv ve'ein boneha to'evin. When the Torah talks about machzir grushaso, it says to'evahi. It is an abomination. The word he is a miyut, so we're learning it is an abomination, meaning this woman is committing an abominable act, but her children are not abominations, which means that the pasuk itself seems to imply that the child is not pagam. That's question number 2. And question number 3, va'otanya hamachzir grushaso, v'hanose chalutzaso, v'hanose krovas chalutzaso, Rabbi Akiva Omer ein lo ba kiddushin, ve'ein atzricha hemenu get, vehi pesula uvlada pasul, v'kofen oso lahotzi. Let's take a look at this brisa. This brisa is an elaboration on the machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. Rabbi Akiva says that if a man remarries his grusha, or if he marries the woman that he had chalitza with, or if he marries his chalutza's sister, in all of those cases, Rabbi Akiva says, there's no tfisas kiddushin. The marriage is a sham. It's not even a legal marriage. And therefore she doesn't need a get in those 3 cases, because remember, according to Rabbi Akiva, even if it's an Isser Lav, there's no tfisas kiddushin and the vlad is a mamzer. And furthermore, this woman becomes puzzled to the kahuna through her act of consort with this forbidden man, and the child is puzzled, and we force them to separate. However, v'chachamim omrim yesh lo ba kiddushin utzricha hemenu get v'hi kashera uvlada kasher. Chachamim disagree on all 4 points. They say, number 1, we agree that it's a forbidden marriage, but if they do get married, the marriage is legal. Number 2, therefore she needs a get in order to divorce him. Number 3, she's still kosher. And number 4, the child is kosher. So you see very clearly that one of these 3 was machzir grushaso. You see in the brisa that a machzir grushaso's child is still kosher. So now let's make sure that we understand the brisa correctly. Laman, lav lekahuna. Doesn't that mean that the child is kosher to the kahuna? So this is our 3rd challenge. How can you tell me that a machzir grushaso's child is puzzled to the kahuna? This brisa says that it's kosher to the kahuna, according to the chachamim. So the Gemara says, lo, lekahal. No, it's not telling you that the child is kosher to the kahuna. It's telling you the child is not a mamzer. The child is allowed to marry a Yisrael. But the Gemara says, wait a minute. Ihachi, hi kasher laman. Then what do you mean? What do the chachamim mean when they say that not only is the offspring kosher, but she is kosher as well, even though she's a machzir grushasa? What does it mean, she's kosher? Ilema lekahal pshita, mishum dezanya ifsala lekahal, question mark. What do you tell me, that she's not a mamzer by marrying her first husband? Of course she's not a mamzer. Why would I ever think that a woman would not be able to marry regular Yisrael just because she did an act of zinus, an act of lewdness that the Torah does not sanction? So elalav lekahuna. So rather, what must it mean? It means that she's not precluded from the kahuna, assuming that she's not a grusha. So we would be referring to the case of a chalutza. In other words, if a man, the achos chalutza also, that if a woman is the sister of a chalutza, and the yavam goes ahead and marries her, and then he dies, the chachamim would say that's a legal marriage, and he has not pasuled her from the kahuna, even though it's an illicit relationship, right? That's all the brisa means. So the Gemara says, umidehi lekahuna vladanami lekahuna. And if the chachamim are saying she's kosher to the kahuna, then the word kosher means for the kahuna. So therefore it must mean that if it says the offspring is kosher, it also must mean kosher for the kahuna. So again, we present this challenge to your assertion that the child of a machzir grushas was puzzled to the kahuna. So the Gemara says, no, midi irya hakidi isa v'hakidi isa. No, the Gemara says, maybe I'll tell you that the word kosher changes based on the context. When we talk about the woman herself being kosher, we mean she's kosher to the kahuna. When we talk about the offspring being kosher, we're saying she's kosher to a Yisrael because she's not a mamzer. And you could sometimes have the very same word referring to 2 different things based on the context. So again, you have no proof. This does not disprove our assertion that a machzir grushas's child is puzzled to the kahuna. And hachanami mistarbe. And by the way, I'll even prove it from the brisa itself. Dikatani reisha hi pesula uvlada pesula. Now, what did Rabbi Akiva say? Rabbi Akiva had said that in a case of machzir grushaso, or you marry the chalutza's sister, then both the woman is puzzle and her child is puzzle. Now let's ask a question. Hipsula laman. When Rabbi Akiva says that she's the machzir grushaso woman is puzzle, who is she puzzle to? Ilema lekahal mishum dezanya ifsula le lekahal. just because she committed an act of znus, you're going to say that she can't marry Yisrael? What does she automatically become a mamzer? That doesn't make any sense. Elalav lekahuna uvlada pasul aman. So it must mean that you're saying that the woman herself cannot marry a Kohen according to Rabbi Akiva. And then you're telling me that her child is pasul. Who is the child pasul to? Ilema lekahuna halakahal kasher hamar Rabbi Akiva vlad mamzer. You can't tell me that when Rabbi Akiva says that the child is pasul, it just means pasul to the kahuna like her mother, because Rabbi Akiva said that not only is the child pasul to the kahuna, but the child is mamish a mamzer in those cases. So elapshita lekahalu midaresha hakideisa v'hakideisa seifanami hakideisa v'hakideisa. So the Gemara says it's clear that just like Rabbi Akiva uses the word kosher in two different contexts to mean two different things, when he says pasul by the mother, he means pasul for the kahuna. When he says pasul by the child, he means that she's mamish a mamzer. So too, when the chachamim say kosher, they mean two different things. When they say that the woman herself is kosher, they mean that she's kosher to the kahuna. And when they say that the daughter is kosher, they mean she's kosher to the kahal, because she's not a mamzer, but they're not necessarily saying that she's kosher to the kahuna. So that brisa we've been able to eliminate as posing a challenge to our assertion that the child of a machzer grushasa was pasul to the kahuna. But what about our first two questions? Let's review our first two questions. The second question was v'hita nami. Remember what the pasuk said, she is an abomination. So therefore we assume that means that only she is an abomination, but her child is perfectly kosher. But no, that's not a problem. So I have another way of reading that pasuk, and we had seen this previously in the Gemara. When the Torah says she is a toeva, all it means to tell me is that if she has a co-wife, in other words, let's say a guy marries his machzer grushaso, and he has another wife, and then he dies. So all the Torah is saying is that the woman who's the machzer grushaso is an abomination, but her tzara, her co-wife, she's not pasul to anything. She's not pasul to the kahuna or anything. She hasn't become tainted by being a tzara. But maybe the pasuk is not at all reflective upon the offspring. So you can't bring me a kasha from the pasuk, because maybe the pasuk is not at all precluding the children from being tainted. But now, what about our first question? Ella almana kasha, mala almana shekain hi atzma mischaleles. But remember, you wanted to bring the whole raya from an almana to a kohen gadol, and we asked you a pircha to that kal v'chomer. Maybe the kal v'chomer is not a valid kal v'chomer. The whole kal v'chomer was that, look, and if an almana to a kohen gadol produces a pasul offspring, then surely a machzer grushaso should produce an invalid offspring. And our pircha to that was, maybe an almana produces an invalid offspring because the marriage itself taints her, whereas the marriage of a machzer grushaso doesn't taint her any more than she is already tainted. So ela I itmar hachi itmar. So the Gemara says, you know what, you're right. We're going to have to modify the whole statement because the argument is not a valid argument. And if anything, therefore, was stated, it was stated as follows: Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Shimon Berebi, Hakol Modim Bava Al Chayve Krisus Shahavlat Pagam. Everyone agrees that if you have a relationship with a woman where the penalty is kares for having a relationship with that woman, let's say Achos Ishto, right? Your sister-in-law. Everyone would agree that the child is pogum in some way. Even if you hold that the child is not a mamzer, you will agree that the child is pogum. And man hakol modim, and who are we referring to when we say that everyone agrees? Rabbi Yoshua, DAF gav Amar Rabbi Yoshua ein mamzer michaybe krisus ni de mamzer lo havi pogum mi havi. Because Rabbi Yoshua has a unique shita, which we also don't paskin like. We paskin like the Chachamim who say that if there's even a chayiv kris kares, or worse, then the child is produced as always a mamzer. Rabbi Yeshua says no. Even from chadi krisus you don't produce a mamzer. You only produce a mamzer when the penalty is death for having a relationship with that woman, such as adultery. And so all we're saying is that even Rabbi Yeshua would agree that even though you don't produce a mamzer from a chayve krisus, but what you do produce is a child who will be pasul to the kahuna. And how do you know this? Mikal v'chomer me'almana. U'ma'almana l'kohen gadol she'en yisur shava bakol ben apagum, zus she'isur shava bakol eno din she'ben apagum. Just like an almana, when she marries a kohen gadol, the child is pagum, even though that isur is only to one man in the world to marry an almana. So surely in this case, where every man is not allowed to marry his sister-in-law, surely if he does, the child produced will be a pogum child. And maybe you'll tell me that an almana is different because she's tainted through the very marriage to the Kohen Gadol, but that's also true in the case over here. When a man marries his sister-in-law, she actually renders her into a zona, and as a result, she becomes puzzled to the kahuna by virtue of the fact that it's an Isser Kares. And therefore, it's exactly analogous, and therefore the Kal V'chomer is a valid Kal V'chomer. And that is what we're arguing. We're going to go a little bit further today. We're just going to run through it quickly. Amar Rabba bar Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Hakol Modim be'Eved v'Ovei Kochavim Habal Bas Yisrael Shal Vlad Mamzer. Everyone agrees, says Rabbi Yochanan, that when a non-Jew, either free or slave, has relations with a Jewish woman, then the child is a mamzer. We do not paskin this way. Okay? That would be a mess. So man hakol modim, what do you mean that everyone agrees? Shimon HaTeimani agrees. The Afal Gav the Amar Shimon HaTeimani ein mamzer michai be'lavin, hani mili michai be'lavin the tafsi buhu kiddushin. Aval hacha obe kochavim ve'eved kivin the lo tafsi buhu kiddushin kechai be'krisus dami. In other words, you might have thought that Shimon HaTeimani only acknowledges the creation of a mamzer when there's a chiyuv kares. Now, if there's no chiyuv kares for a woman to have relations with a Gentile, it's an isser lav, but there's no isser kares. So therefore, you could have argued that according to Shimon HaTeimani, the child is not a mamzer. The chiddush is that Shimon HaTeimani only says that the mamzer is created from a chiyuv krisus when there's, in other words, when there's marriage possible. In other words, when there's marriage possible, that's where Shimon HaTeimani says, since there's no chiyuv kares, you don't create a mamzer, because there's marriage possible. But when marriage is not accomplishable because the man is a Gentile, there Shimon HaTeimani agrees that even though there's no kares, you still create a mamzer. So the Gemara now says Meisvei. Let's challenge that. The Brisa says Obei Kochavim ve'Eved Abal Bas Yisrael Havlad Mamzer. But Reb Shimon ben Yehuda Omer Ein Mamzer Ela Mimi She'isuro Iser Erva Va'anush Kares. You see that there's a machlokas. How can you tell me that everyone agrees, including Shimon HaTeimani, when Reb Shimon ben Yehuda, who I assume is the same as Shimon HaTeimani, I believe, he says that the child is not a mamzer. And because he says he only create a mamzer from an Isser Erva. So how can you tell me that Shimon HaTeimani agrees when you see in the Brisa that he doesn't agree, that a Gentile does not create a mamzer? Ela Omer Rav Yosef Mana Kol Modim Rebbe. Afal Gav de Rebbe Omer Ein Advarm Halalu Amurim Ela L'Divra Rebbe Akiva Sheyaosa Chalutza Ke'erva V'Leilo Sviralei. But Ba'obei Kochavim Eved Modeh. But so even though Rebbe clearly disagrees with Rebbe Akiva, and he says that if a man has a relationship with a woman that he did chalitza with, the child is not a mamzer, he himself does not hold of Rebbe Akiva, even though he cites him in the Mishnah, nevertheless he will agree, and that's what Rabbi Yochanan was trying to show, that even Rebbe, who disagrees with Rabbi Akiva, will hold that an Eved or a Goy who has relations with a Jewish woman, the child is a mamzer. Dechi Asa Rav Dimi Amar Rav Yitzchak Bar Avudimi Bishum Rabbeinu Obei Kochavim Eved Abal Bas Yisrael Avlad mamzer, because we have reliable testimony that when Rabbeinu, that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, was cited by one of his Talmidim, the Talmud says that if a Gentile, either free or slave, has relations with a Bas Yisrael, with a Jewish woman, the child is a mamzer. And we'll hold it here for today. We'll get to a story tomorrow.